The U.S. just made a major move against Russia, and this could get big. Washington has just taken a major step against Russia. The U.S. Senate has overwhelmingly passed a sweeping new sanctions bill targeting Russia and Iran. The vote was 86-11. And while that number may sound like just another vote in Congress, the consequences could be much bigger. Because this legislation could give President Donald Trump new authority to impose tariffs of up to 100% on countries that continue buying large amounts of Russian oil and natural gas. And that could affect some of the world's biggest economies. So, what exactly did the Senate approve? Why is Russia at the center of this fight? And could American consumers eventually feel the impact? Let's break it down. The legislation is called the Lindsey O. Graham Sanctioning Russia and Iran Act of 2026. It is designed to increase economic pressure on Moscow over the war in Ukraine. The bill also includes measures targeting Russian officials, energy-related activities, and Russia's so-called shadow fleet, a network of vessels used to transport Russian oil while attempting to avoid Western restrictions. But the most attention-grabbing part of the legislation is the tariff provision. If the bill becomes law, the president could have authority to impose tariffs of up to 100% on imports from countries that are among the largest buyers of Russian oil and gas. That is where the story becomes much bigger, because countries such as China and India are major buyers of Russian energy. Japan and some European countries could also potentially be affected depending on the final implementation. The goal is straightforward. Washington wants to make it more expensive and more difficult for Russia to earn money from its energy exports. Those energy revenues are extremely important to the Russian economy. And the United States wants to use economic pressure to make the continuation of the war more costly for Moscow. But there is a major question. Could these sanctions create problems outside Russia? The answer is potentially yes. Russia is one of the world's largest energy producers. Oil and natural gas are traded globally. So when major restrictions are placed on Russian energy, markets immediately start watching for changes in supply, demand, and prices. If Russian exports are disrupted, buyers may have to search for alternative suppliers. That could increase competition for oil and other energy products. And whenever energy markets become more expensive, consumers can potentially feel the effects through transportation, manufacturing, and other parts of the economy. That doesn't mean Americans will automatically see higher gasoline prices because of this bill. The final impact would depend on how the law is implemented, how Russia responds, and how global energy markets react. But the possibility is one reason this legislation is getting so much attention. There is another major issue. The bill still has to move through the House of Representatives. The Senate has passed it, but that does not mean the legislation is already law. House lawmakers have raised concerns about giving the president such broad tariff authority. Some lawmakers worry that extremely high tariffs could raise costs for American consumers and businesses. Others argue that stronger economic pressure is necessary to force Russia to change its behavior. So Congress is now facing a major decision. How far should the United States go? And how much economic pressure is too much? That debate could become especially important when lawmakers return from their summer recess. But the Senate vote already sends a powerful message. Washington is showing that there is significant bipartisan support for increasing pressure on Russia. And the vote wasn't close. 86 senators supported the bill. Only 11 voted against it. That tells you just how seriously Congress is taking the issue. The bill also targets Iran. Certain Iran sanctions would continue under the legislation, meaning this is not simply a Russia-only package. It is part of a broader effort to use economic sanctions as a foreign policy tool. But Russia remains the biggest focus. For Moscow, the biggest concern is energy revenue. Russia has spent years adapting to Western sanctions. It has developed alternative trading relationships, found new buyers, and relied on shipping networks that help move Russian energy around existing restrictions. That's why the new legislation focuses not only on Russia itself, but also on countries and companies involved in the global trade of Russian energy. The idea is to attack the economic network supporting those exports. But Russia has options too. Moscow could attempt to find additional buyers. It could redirect energy exports. It could deepen relationships with countries that are willing to continue trading with Russia. And it could respond politically or economically to the United States. That creates another question. Could this lead to a new escalation between Washington and Moscow? Nobody knows yet. The legislation is economic rather than military. But economic sanctions can still have major geopolitical consequences. And if Russia believes its energy revenues are under serious threat, its response will be closely watched. There is also an important issue for American businesses. Tariffs are ultimately paid through the import system. Depending on the product and supply chain, companies can face higher costs when tariffs increase. Businesses may then absorb those costs, change suppliers, or pass some of them on to customers. So if the legislation eventually becomes law and the tariff powers are used aggressively, the effects could extend beyond foreign policy. They could reach trade, energy, manufacturing, and consumer prices. That's why the next stage is so important. The Senate has made its decision. Now the House must decide what happens next. Will lawmakers approve the bill? Will they demand changes? Will the tariff provision survive? And if it does, will President Trump actually use the full authority available to him? Those questions remain unanswered. But one thing is already clear. The United States is preparing to put significantly more economic pressure on Russia. And this time, the pressure could extend beyond Moscow. It could potentially reach countries that continue purchasing Russian energy. That makes this much more than another sanctions announcement. It could become a major test of America's economic power and of how far Washington is willing to go to pressure Russia. For Americans, the biggest things to watch will be energy prices, global oil markets, trade negotiations, and what happens when the House takes up the legislation. For Russia, the key question is how much pressure its energy economy can absorb. And for the rest of the world, the question is whether this new policy will change the global flow of oil and gas. The Senate has already made its move. Now Washington is waiting for the next one. And the next decision could determine whether this becomes one of the biggest economic confrontations between the United States and Russia in years. For more major U.S. stories, breaking developments, and the stories behind the headlines, subscribe to the channel.